She spent her very last $300 on a dying foal, and everyone said she'd lost her mind until the truth came out. She never meant to stop at that dusty auction barn. But in the corner a trembling foal lifted his head, and in that single fragile glance Rachel Carter made a choice that would shatter her finances, defy everyone's warnings, and lead to a miracle no one saw coming. Rachel Carter stood in the parking lot behind the Bozeman Public Library, clutching the week's pay envelope like it might dissolve in her hands. The late winter sky pressed low over Montana, a flat gray blanket that seemed to echo the heaviness sitting inside her chest. She had rehearsed the numbers 3 times already. Rent overdue, utilities threatening disconnection, gas tank nearly empty, and no matter how she rearranged them, they refused to make sense. It felt like life itself had tightened into a narrow hallway with no doors, only walls closing in. Inside the library, students still lingered among the shelves, their laughter drifting out the back door each time someone opened it. Rachel watched them go with a kind of distant ache. She loved books, loved the quiet order of her job, loved helping kids find stories that made their eyes light up. But love didn't pay for groceries, and it didn't stretch a paycheck that was already thin before the divorce. Even now, months after the papers were signed, the remnants of that failed marriage still weighed her down. Attorney fees, credit card debt, and a loneliness that settled over her every evening when the house grew quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator. Her son, Mason, waited in the back seat of her car, legs curled beneath him as he read a dog-eared adventure novel. He glanced up when she opened the door, his round glasses tilted slightly, as always. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, and she forced a smile so familiar it felt like muscle memory, a smile she used when she didn't want him to see how close she stood to the edge. "We're fine," she said softly. "Just a long day." As she drove toward their small apartment on the outskirts of town, the radio murmured static between fading country stations. Snowmelt carved silver veins along the road, reflecting headlights like broken glass. Rachel tried not to think about the small reserve she kept in her bank account, a reserve that had shrunk to 3 crisp $100 bills. Everything else had gone to rent, school lunches, and repairing the aging heater that seemed determined to quit each time a cold front moved in. That money was supposed to last the week. It was supposed to be safe, but nothing felt safe lately. At a stoplight, her gaze drifted toward the distant mountains, their jagged silhouettes carved against the dimming sky. For a moment, she thought of her grandfather's old ranch in Wyoming and the summers she'd spent there as a girl. Mornings filled with the scent of sagebrush, afternoons riding horses along fence, lines that seemed to stretch forever. Back then, the world had felt full of possibility, a story still being written. Now, life felt like a book slammed shut. "Mom?" Mason's voice was gentle. "Can we stop and drop off Mr. Bennett's toolbox like you said?" Right, she had promised. Mr. Bennett, their elderly neighbor, had asked her to return a forgotten toolbox to a livestock auction site where he volunteered. It wouldn't take long, she told herself, just a quick drop-off. One small detour before heading home to microwave leftovers, and another night of worrying whether tomorrow would be any easier. But when she turned into the gravel lot outside the auction barn, something shifted. The air felt colder here, touched by the metallic tang of old hay and the sharp scent of animals. Inside the barn, voices rose and fell, some impatient, some bored, all echoing under the aging rafters. Mason stayed near her side as she stepped in, handing the toolbox to a worker with a polite nod. She could have left right then. She meant to. Yet something tugged at her attention, a faint movement in the far corner of the dim barn. Curiosity, or maybe some old instinct from her childhood, led her to walk closer. That was when she saw him, a foal, skinny enough that each rib cast its own shadow, legs too long for his frail body, coat matted with dirt until its true color was impossible to guess. He stood alone in a small pen, head lowered, sides trembling with each shallow breath. People walked past without a glance, as if he were invisible, but when Rachel approached, the foal lifted his head just slightly. His eyes met hers, dark, quiet, impossibly deep. There was no fear there, only a weary question, a kind of silent plea that reached straight into the tender places she tried so hard to guard. In that instant, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was the memory of gentle horses that once carried her across wide fields. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of single motherhood, or the fragile hope that still glimmered beneath her worry. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized in this small, struggling creature a reflection of her own fading strength. Mason tugged her sleeve. "Mom, he looks sad." Rachel swallowed hard. "Yeah," she whispered, "he does." She knew she should walk away. She had no space, no money, no plan. The foal was not her problem. But as she stood there, listening to the echo of distant auction calls, she felt the impossible pull of a decision forming, one that made no sense at all. And yet, for the first time in months, the world didn't feel like a hallway closing in. It felt like a moment opening. "Mom?" Mason whispered again. "What are you thinking?" Rachel didn't answer. She only kept looking at the foal, and the foal kept looking back, as if neither of them could afford to look anywhere else. This, she realized, was how something extraordinary always began. A single moment, small and quiet, asking whether you still believed in second chances. She took a step closer to the pen, and that is where everything started. Rachel stood there, one hand on the cold metal railing of the pen, feeling the weight of her own heartbeat as the foal's trembling silhouette settled into her awareness. The barn noise faded behind her, the auctioneer's rhythmic chant, the shuffling of boots on concrete, the murmur of buyers discussing prices. None of it seemed to touch the fragile stillness between her and the foal. He watched her with that same quiet intensity, like he was trying to place her somewhere in the puzzle of his short and difficult life. In his eyes, she saw a question she didn't yet know how to answer. Mason remained a step behind, his small fingers curled into her coat sleeve. He wasn't speaking, but she could feel the way he leaned forward, drawn in by the same invisible tether that pulled at her. The foal lifted his head another inch, slow, deliberate, as though the effort cost him more energy than he had to give. His ears flicked toward her, then drooped again, and the motion felt like a fragile gesture of trust. Rachel's throat tightened unexpectedly. There was something heartbreakingly familiar in that exhausted attempt to connect, as if the foal had spent his whole life being overlooked and was startled to find someone actually stopping. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see a worker in a worn canvas jacket. He barely glanced at the foal as he checked the tag clipped to the pen. "If you're looking for a good deal on a horse, this one's not it," he said bluntly, brushing dust off his sleeves. He came in rough, malnourished, no papers. Probably weaned too early. Folks don't want the trouble. He shrugged as if reciting a fact, not a tragedy. "He'll go cheap, but cheap doesn't mean he's worth the feed." Rachel looked back at the foal, who had lowered his head again, chest heaving softly. The worker's words stung more than she expected. Worth the feed. As if that decided the value of a living creature. She felt Mason stiffen beside her, his young face twisting with distress. "But he's just a baby," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the shuffle of hooves. "That's how it goes," the man replied, already moving on. Rachel wasn't sure what made her do it, but she stepped closer to the pen, close enough to feel the faint warmth rising from the foal's battered body. She slowly reached out her hand, not touching him yet, just letting him see the gesture. For a long moment nothing happened. Then he shifted his weight, shaky but intentional, edging toward her with a fragile curiosity. His breath touched her fingertips, warm and unsteady. The tiny contact felt like a vow offered in silence. She swallowed hard. "Hey, sweetheart," she murmured, the words escaping her before she even knew she'd spoken. "You're trying, aren't you?" Mason inched beside her, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Mom, he likes you." Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. Something inside her was unraveling, a tight knot of exhaustion, fear, and stubborn hope loosening all at once. This wasn't logical. This wasn't responsible. Buying a foal when she could barely afford groceries was the kind of thing people joked about in cautionary tales. But as the foal pressed the tip of his nose lightly against her sleeve, it hit her with startling clarity. Walking away would feel wrong in a way she couldn't explain. A sudden burst of applause erupted from the auction ring as a high-priced mare sold, snapping her momentarily out of the trance. She blinked, realizing how long she'd been standing there. The worker's voice echoed from across the barn. "Next horse up in 10. Get your bids ready." They would bring the foal out soon. They would call for bids. Someone else, someone who saw him as a burden rather than a life, might take him home. Or worse, he might go unnoticed entirely and slip into the margins of the livestock system where unwanted animals disappeared quietly. That thought made her stomach twist. "Mom?" Mason tugged gently at her sleeve. Are we leaving?" Rachel looked down at him. His eyes weren't pleading. They were searching, hopeful in a way she hadn't seen since before the divorce. She realized he needed something to believe in every bit as much as she did. And this moment, this small, strange moment with a suffering foal, felt like it was offering them both the same thing, the possibility of a different kind of future. "No," she said softly, "not yet." She stepped back from the pen, her pulse quickening as if she'd crossed an invisible line she could never uncross. She felt the gravity of what was unfolding, though she could not yet name it. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear of overdue bills and the heaviness of single motherhood, a quiet conviction flickered. Something like courage, or perhaps simply the refusal to let another vulnerable life slip through the cracks. The foal lifted his head again, as if sensing her choice. And Rachel, heart pounding, knew she was about to do something the world would call foolish, something people would whisper about, something extraordinary. The auction ring hummed with restless energy as Rachel found herself drifting toward the rows of folding chairs, each step feeling strangely detached from her body. She hadn't meant to stay, hadn't meant to linger long enough for the foal to be brought out under the harsh lights. But her feet were moving, and Mason followed quietly beside her, as if he sensed an invisible current pulling them forward. The barn felt colder now, the metallic scent of dust and hay settling thick in the air, and every sound seemed to echo inside her chest. She took a seat near the back, hoping the anonymity of the shadows might steady her racing thoughts. She had no business being here. She knew that. Yet, her eyes drifted again and again to the side entrance where animals were let in one by one. Her palms were damp. Her heartbeat drummed against her ribs. She tried to tell herself she was only staying to... what? To be sure the foal wasn't mistreated? To convince herself she'd done all she could by simply caring? None of the reasons felt true. All she knew was that she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Mason leaned closer. "Do you think someone kind will get him?" he whispered. Rachel wished she could offer him reassurance. Instead, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope so." When the next horse finished bidding, the announcer's voice boomed across the barn, rough and practiced. "All right, folks, bring the little one out." Rachel stiffened. 2 handlers appeared, coaxing the frail gray foal into the ring. Under the bright lights, he looked even smaller, his thin frame casting a long, fragile shadow on the dusty floor. His legs wobbled as he tried to stand tall, but each movement seemed to ripple exhaustion through his body. Murmurs swept through the crowd, a mix of pity and disinterest. A man in the front row chuckled under his breath. Someone else whispered, "Poor thing won't last the month." Rachel felt her throat tighten. The auctioneer glanced at the foal, unimpressed. "We'll start the bidding at $500. Do I hear 5? Silence. 400? More silence, broken only by the foal's weak snort as he shifted uncomfortably. 300, folks. Let's at least make this worth our time. Rachel's breath stalled. 300. The exact number that lay folded inside her wallet, the last money keeping their fragile life afloat. She heard the worker's earlier words echo in her mind, worth the feed, and something hot and sharp flared in her chest. Maybe it was anger, maybe heartbreak, or maybe the realization that if she did nothing, this little creature with the quiet eyes would be lost. Mason tugged at her arm gently, almost pleadingly. The auctioneer scanned the room. 300? Anyone? Rachel didn't remember making the decision. She didn't even feel her body move. Her hand simply rose, trembling but unmistakably deliberate. "I've got 300 from the lady in the back," the announcer barked, sounding surprised someone had taken the bait. "Do I hear 350? For an instant she thought she might actually get him, might walk away having saved a life. But then a man in a worn leather jacket lifted 2 fingers lazily, barely looking up from his phone. The crowd stirred. 350. Do I hear 4? Rachel's stomach dropped. She couldn't go higher. She shouldn't have gone this high. What was she doing? She tried to lower her hand discreetly, wishing she could take back the impulsive bid. The man raised his hand again. 4. The auctioneer nodded, pleased. 400. Do I hear 450? Another nod. From the man. He wasn't hesitant or emotional. He was simply purchasing, acquiring. Like the foal was nothing more than a low-risk gamble. Rachel felt a wave of dread wash over her. She had seen men like him before, buyers who scooped up the unwanted for reasons no one wanted to speak aloud, the kind of buyer who didn't need to know a horse's name. The bidding climbed, 450, then 500, and Rachel sat frozen as reality pressed down on her. She had lost. Even worse, she might have just delivered the foal straight into the hands of someone who didn't intend to give him a chance. But then the auctioneer hesitated. He frowned, tapped his clipboard, then looked directly at the man in the leather jacket. "Sir, before I call this sale, are you purchasing for personal care or for resale?" A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. The man stood abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and walked out of the ring without answering. The auctioneer nodded sharply. "All right then, state regulations require that we nullify bids from buyers unwilling to verify care intentions on animals under 6 months." He looked around. "In that case, our last legitimate bid stands at 300, from the lady in the back." Rachel blinked. Had she heard him right? 300 going once, going twice. Her heart pounded so loudly she almost missed the final word. "Sold!" A few heads turned toward her, some pitying, some amused, some shaking in disbelief. Mason clutched her hand, eyes wide with joy and fear tangled together. Rachel sat frozen, her breath shallow. She had just spent her last $300 on a foal who might not survive the week. She had made a decision that could unravel everything she was barely holding together. But when she looked toward the ring, the foal was staring back at her, as if he understood something had shifted. as if he knew she had chosen him. And though terror surged through her, another feeling threaded quietly beneath it, a small, trembling spark of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The sun had slipped behind the mountains by the time Rachel pulled into Hank Thompson's small property at the edge of town. The headlights swept across sagging fence lines and a weather-beaten barn that leaned slightly to one side, as though years of Montana winters had pushed it off balance. Still, warm yellow light seeped from the cracks in the boards, and smoke curled from a metal chimney pipe, a quiet promise that someone inside cared enough to keep the place alive, even if everything about it looked tired. Hank met them at the trailer with a soft grunt of greeting, his lined face half hidden under the brim of his wool hat. He was a retired cavalryman with a stiff gait and a voice textured like gravel, but there was a steadiness in his presence that Rachel had always trusted. When she'd called earlier, her voice shaking as she asked if he had room for a foal. She couldn't explain. He didn't hesitate. "Bring him," he'd said simply. "We'll figure it out." Now, as the trailer door creaked open, Finch staggered slightly, blinking under the dim barn lights. He seemed even smaller under the open sky, a fragile silhouette framed against the pale snow. Mason hurried forward, but Hank held out a hand gently. "Slow," he murmured. "Let him take things one step at a time." Rachel nodded, though her heartbeat hammered with worry. She had expected Finch to look weak after the auction, but seeing him here, wobbling on unsteady legs, thin as winter branches, made the weight of her decision crash onto her shoulders. She had chosen this. She had chosen him, and now she had to live with it. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old wood wrapped around them like a blanket. Finch was guided into an empty stall near the back, a narrow space with mismatched boards and a roof patch so obvious even Mason noticed it. But there was fresh straw on the ground, a bucket of clean water, and enough warmth from the chimney's heat to take the edge off the night air. Finch lowered himself onto the straw almost immediately, curling his legs beneath him. His body trembled in small, involuntary shivers, and Rachel instinctively crouched beside him. She didn't touch him yet. She wasn't sure if he was too sore or too scared, but she stayed close enough that he could see her clearly. His eyes found hers, just as they had in the auction barn, and something in his expression softened, as if acknowledging he remembered her. Mason knelt carefully at Rachel's side. "Mom, is he going to be okay?" Rachel wished she had an answer. Instead, she brushed a stray hair from Mason's forehead. "We're going to try," she whispered. "That's what matters tonight." Hank joined them, folding his arms as he studied the foal's breathing. "He's weak," he said plainly, but not unkindly. "Overworked body, not enough feed, maybe dealing with parasites or a cold, but I've seen worse come back around." He paused, then added with unexpected gentleness, "He's got fight in him. You can see it in how he's holding on." Rachel nodded, though a knot tightened deep in her chest. Fight or not, Finch's fate depended on care she wasn't sure she could afford. The guilt rose quickly, like a tide threatening to drown her. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, afraid the fear might spill out in words she didn't want Mason to hear. But Mason was already busying himself in the way children do when they sense adults are hurting. He pulled off his knitted scarf, blue with frayed edges, and draped it carefully over Finch's neck. "It'll help him stay warm," he murmured. Finch didn't move, but his ear flicked toward the boy, and the faintest sigh left his nostrils. The simplicity of the gesture broke something inside Rachel. She leaned forward, resting her hand lightly on Finch's shoulder. His coat was rough and cold beneath her palm, the bones beneath it sharp as stones, but he didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to settle into the touch. Outside, wind scraped against the barn walls, rattling loose boards like distant thunder. Inside, the world felt small and quiet. just the three of them and a creature who had somehow become the fragile center of their hopes. The warm light flickered across Finch's thin frame, throwing long shadows that made him appear both ghostly and miraculous at once. Hank stepped back toward the barn door. "I'll mix some warm mash and electrolytes for him. It won't fix everything tonight, but it'll give him a boost." He paused, giving Rachel a knowing look. "Get some rest after. Tomorrow will be a long day." When he left, the silence settled again. Rachel sank onto the straw beside Finch, drawing her knees to her chest. Mason rested against her shoulder, both of them watching the foal breathe, each rise and fall precious, uncertain. "Mom," Mason whispered, barely audible, "he looked at you when you touched him." Rachel swallowed. "I know. And he didn't look scared." "No," she said softly, "he didn't." She could feel Mason thinking beside her, his young mind turning over questions he was too kind to ask aloud. They had no money to spare, no experience caring for a sick foal, no guarantees at all. But as Finch's breathing steadied into a slow, rhythmic pattern, a warmth settled in Rachel's chest that she hadn't felt in months, something old and familiar, trust maybe, or courage. She shifted slightly, and Finch lifted his head, leaning just barely into her hand, as if anchoring himself to her presence. Rachel closed her eyes and exhaled shakily. Whatever tomorrow brought, they had already crossed a line. And she knew, deep down, there was no going back. Morning crept slowly across Hank's property, brushing pale gold across the frost-covered ground. Rachel stepped out of her car with a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a knot of worry in her stomach. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Finch lying in the straw, trembling as if fighting a battle. Too big for his thin body. Now, as she approached the barn, she braced herself for the possibility that he might not have made it through the night. But when she pushed the door open, warm air drifted toward her, carrying the scent of hay, and something sweeter, molasses maybe, from the mash Hank had prepared. The barn lights hummed softly. Finch was still curled on the straw, but this time his ears perked faintly at the sound of her footsteps. His eyes opened, slow and heavy, but clear, alive. Relief washed through her so abruptly her knees nearly buckled. She moved closer, kneeling beside him, letting him see her before reaching out. When her fingers brushed his neck, he didn't shy away. Instead, he shifted just a little closer, as though he remembered her warmth from the night before. The gesture was small, barely a movement at all, but to Rachel it felt like watching the first crack of dawn after a long winter. Mason hurried in behind her, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "He's awake," he gasped, skidding to Finch's stall. "Mom, look, he's really awake this time." His voice echoed through the barn, bright and hopeful. Finch's ears flicked toward him, and Mason's grin widened. "Hi, buddy," he whispered. "We're back." Hank appeared from the feed room with a scoop in hand. "He made it," he said, nodding toward the foal with quiet approval. "Didn't think he'd perk up this much overnight, but he's got spirit. That counts for more than folks realize." Rachel exhaled. "Thank God." "Don't thank him yet," Hank replied, though there was a hint of humor tucked into the gravel of his voice. "We've got a long road ahead, but he's fighting. That's good news." Rachel watched as Hank slid a shallow pan of warm mash into the stall. Finch lifted his head slowly, stretching his neck until his soft nose brushed the edge of the pan. His tongue flicked out, tasting the mixture. Then, with surprising determination, he began to eat. The sound of his small teeth scraping against the tin pan was the sweetest sound Rachel had heard in months. Mason leaned against the stall railing, eyes wide. "He's hungry." "That means he's going to get better, right?" "It means he's trying," Hank replied. "And trying's the first step to anything worth doing." Rachel swallowed hard, touched by the simple truth of it. Trying was all any of them had been doing lately. Trying to stay afloat, trying to hold on to hope, trying not to let the heavy parts of life bury them. And now Finch, frail and shaking, was doing the same. It felt symbolic in a way she wasn't ready to admit. For the next hour they stayed by Finch's side, letting him eat in slow, thoughtful bites. His ribs were still sharp beneath his skin, and every movement seemed too large for the strength he had. But there was a spark in him, a flicker of stubborn life that hadn't been there the night before. When he finally finished eating, he lifted his head and looked directly at Rachel. His eyes held something steady, something that felt like a promise neither of them fully understood. "I think he knows who saved him," Mason said suddenly. Rachel shook her head gently. "I didn't save him. We just gave him a chance." "But that's what saving someone is," Mason insisted, his small voice resolute. "You give them a chance when nobody else will." Rachel didn't know how to respond. She only reached for his shoulder, pulling him closer, her heart swelling with something fragile and warm. She wasn't used to being seen as someone capable of rescuing anything. She was the one barely hanging on. Yet here she was, kneeling beside a creature that had come back from the brink because she refused to walk away. Hank checked Finch's legs, gently lifting one hoof with practiced hands. "Good structure," he muttered, "surprisingly good. If he fills out right, he might grow into something sturdy." He set the hoof back down and straightened slowly. Don't let his condition fool you. Sometimes the ones who start out rough end up the strongest. Rachel brushed Finch's neck again, feeling the texture of his tangled coat beneath her fingertips. "What do you think he'll be like when he grows up?" Hank shrugged. "Hard to tell from this stage, but he watches everything. That's a good sign. Horses that pay attention tend to learn fast." As if to prove his point, Finch turned his head toward the sound of a bird outside, his ears twitching in perfect symmetry. Then he looked back at Rachel and rested his chin lightly against her knee, a gesture so trusting it made her eyes sting. Mason let out a small laugh. "He likes you better than he likes me." "He likes you both," Rachel said softly. "Maybe he's just figuring out who we are." Mason tilted his head thoughtfully. "Can we teach him stuff, like tricks, or maybe racing, or something big?" "That's a conversation for later," Rachel replied, smoothing his hair. "Right now, we just help him get strong." But even as she said it, she felt a small spark of curiosity flicker to life. She had seen the way Finch moved, the way he observed the world with a kind of quiet intelligence. There was something in him waiting to unfold, something she couldn't name yet. The morning light filtered through the barn window, warming Finch's coat, making it shimmer faintly beneath the dirt. For a moment he didn't look like a neglected foal. He looked like the beginning of a story that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Rachel leaned back on her heels, her chest full in a way that felt new and unfamiliar, like the beginning of a long-overdue healing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The bills would still come, the worries would still linger, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something shift. Hope didn't always arrive with certainty or strength. Sometimes it came in the shape of a trembling foal who decided to take one more bite of food. And sometimes that was enough. By the end of the second week, Finch was standing longer, eating more eagerly, and watching the world with a newfound brightness that hadn't been there when Rachel first saw him. Each day brought tiny changes, subtle but unmistakable signs that life was returning to his thin frame. It was in the way he lifted his head a little higher, in the soft whicker he made when Mason approached, in the quiet intelligence glowing behind his dark eyes. Rachel found herself drawn to the barn after every shift, even when exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Something about Finch's presence made the burdens of the day feel less crushing, as if Simply being near him reminded her she wasn't entirely broke on hope. Late one afternoon, after picking up Mason from school, they stopped by Hank's place. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind swept across the property with the sharp scent of wet earth. Inside the barn, the warm air enveloped them like a sanctuary. Finch was standing near the front of his stall, his ears pricking forward when he heard their footsteps. He took a small step toward them, steady now, almost confident. "You're getting stronger," Rachel murmured as she slipped through the stall gate. Finch reached out gently, touching her sleeve with his nose, as if agreeing. Mason stroked his neck, proudly pointing out every new patch of cleaner coat they had brushed, and every day Finch seemed to glow a little more under their care. Hank wandered over, hands in his pockets, watching the foal with a narrowed, thoughtful gaze. "He's filling out," he said. "Still needs time, but he's moving better. You notice how he keeps his balance?" Rachel glanced down. Finch was shifting his weight carefully, distributing it with surprising precision for a recovering foal. "Is that unusual?" "For most young ones, yes." Hank leaned his elbow against the gate. "He's studying where he puts every foot. That's something you don't teach easily. Comes natural to horses built for long distances." Mason tilted his head. "Like racing?" "Not racing," Hank corrected gently. "Endurance riding. Horses that run for miles across tough trails and mountains. The kind that don't just sprint. They think while they move." Rachel blinked. "Finch? Endurance?" Hank nodded. "Watch him." They fell silent as Finch stepped back, ears sharpened toward the open barn door. His movements were careful, efficient, almost strategic. Even in weakness, he carried himself with an instinctive awareness of the space around him. Mason grinned. "He's smart, I told you, Mom." Rachel smiled faintly. "You did." A sudden gust of wind rattled the loose boards of the barn. Finch startled, but instead of bolting, he pivoted in a smooth arc, placing himself between Rachel and the sound. It was a protective gesture, subtle but unmistakable. Rachel felt her breath catch. It was as if Finch understood them too, learning their rhythms as surely as they learned his. When the wind settled, Hank chuckled softly. "See, natural instincts. He's watching out for you." He paused, then added, "Not every horse does that, only the ones that bond deep." Rachel's hand rested lightly on Finch's shoulder. She felt the warmth beneath his coat, the strength slowly rebuilding. "What does that mean for him?" she asked. "It means," Hank said, "that he might be something special one day." Rachel's heart thudded, not with excitement, but with a quiet, aching hope she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel. Special. It wasn't a word she heard often, not in her life, not in anything she touched. The idea that this fragile foal she'd gambled everything on might grow into more than just survival made something inside her stir. "Try leading him," Hank suggested. Rachel hesitated, but picked up the rope halter. Finch stepped forward willingly, matching her pace with surprising accuracy. She turned right. Finch followed. She slowed. He slowed. She stopped. He stopped, touching her hand with his soft nose, as if to say, "Was that right? Did I do well?" "You see," Hank said, "he reads you, picks up cues fast. That's a rare trait. Some horses go their whole lives without that kind of focus." Mason beamed. "He's amazing." Rachel couldn't deny it. There was something intuitive in Finch's movements, something that felt like a natural rhythm syncing with her own. As she led him back into the stall, the barn door creaked open and a tall woman stepped inside. She carried a travel-worn duffel bag slung across her shoulder and wore a windbreaker spattered with mud. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, swept across the barn before landing on Finch. "Is this the little guy everyone keeps whispering about?" she asked. Hank straightened. "Rachel. Mason, this is Lydia Brooks. She trains endurance horses." Lydia approached Finch with measured steps, letting him see her before she got close. She crouched just outside the stall, studying his legs, his posture, his alertness. Finch watched her closely, ears flicking, but stayed relaxed. "This one has the look," she said finally. Rachel blinked. "The look?" Lydia nodded. "Awareness, precision, controlled curiosity. Horses bred for endurance have a certain way about them, especially the old Wyoming lines. They were known for intelligence and grit." She stood, brushing dust from her knee. "Where'd he come from?" Rachel hesitated. "An auction, no papers, no history." Lydia's brow lifted. "Interesting." The word hung in the air like a spark. Finch took a small step toward Lydia, sniffing her jacket sleeve, and she smiled. "You've got heart, boy. That matters more than bloodlines." Mason clasped his hands together. "Does that mean he's going to be a champion?" Lydia chuckled. "Slow down, cowboy. First he needs to get strong. But," she looked to Rachel, "if you're willing, I'd like to stop by again, see how he grows. There might be something here worth exploring." Rachel felt her pulse quicken. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a prediction. But it was the first time someone with knowledge, someone who saw hundreds of horses a year, looked at Finch and didn't see a mistake. She saw potential. As Lydia walked back into the windswept yard, Finch nudged Rachel's shoulder lightly. She leaned into him, her eyes softening. "You knew your path before we even saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. Finch exhaled gently, warm breath brushing her cheek. And in that small moment, something new settled in Rachel's heart, a feeling more resilient than hope. Possibility. Spring crept into Montana as if testing the land's patience, melting the snow inch by inch, warming the ground with hesitant sunlight. By the time the first buds appeared on the cottonwoods near Hank's barn, Finch had transformed from a trembling shadow of a foal into a creature with presence, still lean, still fragile in places, but steady now, with a brightness in his eyes that hadn't existed before. Rachel felt it every time she saw him, a quiet swell of disbelief at how far he'd come. She never imagined that something so small, so close to slipping away, could grow into the center of their lives with such gentle certainty. One Saturday morning, Rachel and Mason arrived to find Lydia already waiting near the paddock. She leaned casually against the fence, her windbreaker rippling in the cool breeze, her gaze fixed on Finch as he moved across the enclosure. He wasn't running. He wasn't strong enough for that yet, but he walked with a purposeful rhythm, each step measured, each shift of weight deliberate. "There it is again," Lydia murmured as Rachel and Mason approached. "That way he reads the terrain. He's not just looking, he's calculating." Rachel blinked at her. "Calculating?" Lydia nodded. "Endurance horses memorize ground patterns instinctively. Saves energy on long rides. Most young ones trip or overstep. He adjusts before he even lifts his hoof." Mason practically vibrated beside her. "Does that mean he's getting really good?" "It means," Lydia said with a small smile, "he's built for something more than surviving." Her words lingered in the cool air, heavier than Rachel expected. She watched Finch pause at the far end of the paddock, ears swirling toward the sound of a distant vehicle, before calmly scanning the fence line. He wasn't skittish anymore. He was aware. Hank stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Lydia's been here a while," he said, "studying him like he's a math problem." "He is a math problem," Lydia replied. "An interesting one." Rachel felt a ripple of curiosity and wariness. "Why, he doesn't even have papers." "Paperwork doesn't give a horse instinct," Lydia said plainly, "and instinct doesn't lie." Finch spotted them and moved toward the fence, his ears pricking forward. Mason hurried to greet him, stroking his muzzle with boyish excitement. Finch leaned into the touch, relaxed and trusting. It was then a sleek black truck rolled up the gravel drive, its polished exterior so out of place among Hank's weathered buildings that Rachel felt tension grip her spine. The door opened, and a tall man in a pressed jacket stepped out. He carried himself with brisk confidence and an air of impatience. "Morning," he called, striding across the yard. His boots barely collected dust. "I'm looking for the Youngs, endurance prospect I've been hearing about." Rachel froze. Prospect. The word felt dangerous. Lydia straightened. "Who told you anything?" "Word gets around," the man replied with a dismissive smile. "That's how this business works. You train one good horse, people talk. You find a rare one, people talk louder." His gaze drifted to Finch, lingering on the foal's balanced stance. "That must be him." Hank stepped forward protectively. "What do you want?" "A conversation," the man said, turning to Rachel. "You're the owner, yes?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I am. My name's Carter Wells," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "I buy promising young stock for competitive endurance programs, and I'm prepared to make you a serious offer." Rachel's heart thudded painfully. "For Finch? Is that his name?" Wells asked, glancing at the foal. "Fine, Finch." He slid his hands into his jacket pockets. "I'll give you $75,000 for him. Immediate payment." Mason gasped. Rachel felt the world sway. 75,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. It was more money than she'd ever seen in one place, more than enough to pay off her debts, move to a better apartment, fix her aging car, secure stability she hadn't felt in years. It was a lifeline thrown directly into her hands. But Finch whinnied softly, nudging Mason's shoulder with gentle familiarity. The boy giggled, hugging his neck. The simple affection twisted something deep inside Rachel. Wells followed her gaze. "Look," he said, softening his tone. "He's a nice little project for a family, sure. But he'll never reach his full potential here. I can give him access to training, facilities, championships. He's better off with me. And frankly, you're better off with the money." Rachel's throat tightened. The words were reasonable, logical, the kind of logic she used when paying bills or deciding what groceries to cut. Logic that governed every part of her life except this one fragile place where she'd made a decision from the heart. Lydia stepped closer, eyes sharp. "You've barely seen him," she said. "You have no idea what he's capable of." "I know enough," Wells replied. "And I know opportunity when I see it." He turned to Rachel again. "I'll give you 24 hours to decide." He walked back to his truck without another word, leaving dust swirling in his wake. Mason turned to her, panic dawning in his eyes. "Mom, you're not selling him, right?" Rachel opened her mouth, but no sound came. $75,000. A rescue foal who needed her. A child who loved him. A man offering a future she couldn't afford. A choice that felt like tearing her heart in half. Lydia laid a hand on her arm. "You don't owe that man anything," she said quietly. "And Finch doesn't need a corporation. He needs the people who stayed when he had nothing." Rachel looked at Finch, at the warm trust in his eyes that had not existed weeks ago, and felt something inside her crack softly, painfully. She didn't know her answer yet, but she knew it wasn't simple. That night the wind pushed against the apartment windows with a low, restless hum, as if echoing the turmoil inside Rachel's chest. She sat at the kitchen table long after Mason had gone to bed, staring at an unpaid stack of bills spread out like accusations. The bold red reminder on the electric bill. The car insurance notice. The grocery list with half the items crossed out. And on top of it all, her bank account balance sitting at a number so small it almost looked like a mistake. $75,000. The offer circled in her mind like a hawk searching for a weak point, dipping lower every time she blinked. It wasn't just a number, it was an escape hatch, a chance to breathe again, a way out of the constant calculation, the silent panic she carried to bed each night. She could fix everything with a single decision. But each time she tried to picture Finch in someone else's hands, something inside her tightened painfully. She remembered how he leaned into her touch, how his ears flicked toward Mason's laugh, how he had slowly learned that the world wasn't a place meant to break him. She had saved him, but he had saved something in her too, something she didn't know was still alive. Rachel rested her forehead against her hands. The logical part of her brain screamed for the money. The part shaped by years of struggle and disappointment told her not to be foolish. Yet her heart, a part she'd learned to silence, whispered something entirely different. The floor creaked softly, and she looked up to see Mason standing in the dim light of the hallway, clutching his blanket. His hair stuck up in tired tufts, and his glasses were slightly crooked. "Mom," he whispered, "you're not sleeping." Rachel forced a gentle smile. "I was just thinking." Mason padded over, dragging a chair beside her. "About Finch?" She hesitated. "Yes." His small hands twisted in the fabric of his blanket. "Do we have to sell him?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Sweetheart, Mr. Wells offered a lot of money, more than we've ever had. It could help us. It could change things." "But it would change everything for him, too," Mason replied quietly, his voice trembling at the edges. "He finally trusts us. What if he thinks we left him like the other people did?" The words struck Rachel sharper than she expected. She pulled Mason into her arms, holding him as his breath hitched. "Oh, honey, Finch wouldn't think that. He knows we love him. But love doesn't matter if he's gone," Mason whispered into her shoulder. "Please don't let him go, Mom. He's my best friend." Rachel's chest tightened. She had been so focused on her own guilt, her own fears, that she had overlooked what Finch meant to Mason. The boy who had struggled to smile after the divorce now rushed out the door to see a foal. The boy who once avoided talking to classmates now had stories to tell about the horse who knew how to listen. Finch wasn't just a rescue. He was a bridge back to joy. "Let me show you something," Rachel murmured. She stood and walked to the small bookshelf in the living room, pulling out a worn notebook. Inside were sketches Mason had drawn over the past weeks. Finch trotting in the paddock. Finch sleeping in the straw. Finch nudging his head against Mason's shoulder. Some drawings were smudged from being carried around too often. One page even had Finch wearing Mason's scarf, both of them smiling in a way only a child could imagine. When she returned, Mason's eyes widened. "You found it." "I didn't know how much you loved drawing him," Rachel said softly. "I'm going to ride him one day," Mason whispered. "And he's going to be fast and brave. And he's going to know I'm his forever." Rachel's heart cracked open. She held her son close, breathing in the scent of his hair, feeling the tremble of fear he was trying so hard to hide. The thought of tearing this bond away, for money, for logic, felt suddenly unbearable. When Mason finally drifted back to sleep, Rachel stepped outside onto the small balcony. The night was cold, stars faint behind a thin veil of clouds. She wrapped her sweater tighter around herself and stared into the dark, letting the truth settle like snow. Finch wasn't a mistake. Finch wasn't a burden. Finch was the first spark of color in a life that had gone gray. She closed her eyes, a decision blooming inside her like the quiet unfurling of dawn. The next morning she drove to Hank's with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. Finch lifted his head when she entered the barn, his warm breath puffing into the air like a greeting. He stepped toward her with quiet confidence, nudging her arm, as if sensing the shift in her spirit. Rachel rested her forehead against his. "You're staying," she whispered, "no matter what they offer. You're ours." Mason cheered, hugging Finch's leg before Rachel could stop him. Hank chuckled in approval. Even Finch seemed to stand a little taller. Later that afternoon, when Carter Wells returned expecting paperwork, Rachel met him beside the paddock. "I'm not selling him," she said before he could speak. Wells blinked, stunned. "You're turning down $75,000. "Yes." "Why?" Rachel exhaled slowly, steady. "Because money isn't the only thing worth fighting for." Wells stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head, muttering something under his breath, and climbing back into his truck. Rachel watched him leave without regret. Behind her, Finch whinnied softly, bright, certain, alive. Her decision had been reckless, illogical, impossible, and absolutely right. By early summer, Hank's property had changed in ways that mirrored Finch himself. Subtle at first, then suddenly undeniable. Snowmelt fed the pastures, turning them into rolling stretches of soft green, and the mountains beyond Bozeman glowed blue in the warm light. Every afternoon, Rachel found herself drawn to the barn as if something magnetic lived inside it, pulling her forward through long workdays and tight budgets. And every afternoon, Finch was there waiting, stronger, steadier, and filled with a quiet determination that made her chest swell with pride. Lydia visited more frequently now. What began as casual curiosity had grown into something like professional fascination. She often leaned against the paddock rail with narrowed eyes as Finch moved, tracking each step the way a musician might analyze the notes of a promising melody. "He's learning himself," she said one day, "learning his body, learning the land. That's rare, Rachel. You can't train a horse to care about the ground beneath his feet. They either do or they don't." Finch did. One warm afternoon, Lydia suggested something new. "Let's see how he handles the open trail. Nothing strenuous, just a taste of the world beyond this fence." Rachel's pulse fluttered nervously, but she trusted Lydia's instincts. So they guided Finch out of the paddock and toward the trail that wound gently behind Hank's property. The foothills stretched in soft curves, dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers. The breeze carried the scent of pine and distant summer rain. Finch stepped onto the path with deliberate care. His ears flicked forward, then sideways, taking in every shift of wind and rustle of grass. Mason walked beside him, holding the lead rope with quiet excitement. "You've got this, buddy," he whispered. As they made their way up a gentle incline, Finch surprised them. Instead of hesitating, he lengthened his stride, sure-footed, confident, as though the mountain trail spoke a familiar language he had been waiting to hear again. He didn't rush. He thought. Each movement carried intention, a natural rhythm that suited the uneven ground. Watching him, Rachel felt a slow, blooming recognition. This wasn't just recovery. This was purpose. When they reached a crest overlooking the valley, Finch paused, turning his head toward the open distance. His mane fluttered in the wind as he surveyed the vast spread of land below, fields, barns, the winding river catching sunlight like a ribbon of silver. It struck Rachel how regal he looked, even without the fullness of muscle he would someday have. He stood as if claiming the world with quiet dignity. Lydia exhaled. "He's reading the horizon," she murmured. "Endurance horses track space by instinct. They map it as they move." Rachel stepped beside Finch, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's like he belongs here." "He does," Lydia said. "But more than that, he belongs out there. Those long-distance circuits in the Rockies? He's made for them." Mason beamed. "He really could compete someday?" Lydia nodded slowly. If he stays healthy, and if you're willing to put in the work, he could be exceptional. The word exceptional wrapped around Rachel like a warm breath. Not just good, not decent. Exceptional. For a foal who had once been too weak to stand, it felt like hearing a prophecy. They walked back down the trail at a gentle pace, Finch's steps steady and grounded. As they reached the barn, Hank waved them over, a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. "Got something you might want to see," he said, handing it to Rachel. The headline caught her eye instantly. Local Endurance Trainer Scouts. Rising talent in small Montana town. A photograph showed Lydia beside a young horse, not Finch, but a champion she had trained years ago. The article described her reputation, the horses she had turned into legends, the bloodlines she knew as intimately as her own family roots. But at the bottom, a short quote caught her breath. "Every once in a while, a horse comes along who doesn't follow the usual rules. Those horses don't arrive polished. They grow into their greatness." Rachel looked up, meeting Lydia's gaze. "Is that about Finch?" "Indirectly," Lydia said with a shrug that couldn't hide her smile. "Reporters ask general questions. I gave a general answer." But Rachel saw the truth in her eyes. Finch was one of those rare ones. The realization struck her with equal parts awe and fear. The world would soon see what she already knew. Finch wasn't ordinary. And that meant their lives could shift again, maybe in ways she couldn't control. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains in a blaze of gold and rose, Rachel brought Finch to the fence line, letting him graze while she leaned against the wooden post. The landscape stretched wide and quiet around them. The wind was soft now, threading through the grass like a whisper of promise. "Do you know what you're becoming?" she murmured, tracing the line of his neck. Finch lifted his head, pressing it gently to her shoulder. Rachel closed her eyes. This horse, this soul she had saved with her last $300, was leading them toward a future she had never dared to imagine. And he walked toward it with confidence, not fear. A gust of wind swept around them, carrying the faint echo of distant thunder rolling over the Rockies. It felt like a sign, not of danger, but of momentum, of something building. Finch lifted his head sharply, ears pricking toward the mountains. He was ready. And for the first time, Rachel realized she was too. Autumn swept into Montana with the slow grace of a lantern being dimmed, turning the mountains copper and gold. The mornings grew crisp, the evenings cool enough that Finch's breath floated like pale smoke as he trotted across the paddock. He was nearly unrecognizable from the trembling creature Rachel had rescued months ago, muscles beginning to shape his once narrow frame, his stride longer and smoother, his coat catching the sunlight with a soft sheen. There was a calm certainty to his movements now, as if he had stepped fully into the life he had been meant for. Rachel stood by the fence, coffee warming her hands, watching Finch move beneath the rising sun. Mason sat cross-legged nearby, sketching in his notebook. A newer one now, its pages already filled with drawings of mountains, training trails, and Finch's steady transformation. Lydia and Hank were walking the fence line, discussing winter prep and new routes for training. It was a morning like any other, and yet it felt like the beginning of something bigger. "Mom," Mason said softly, looking up from his drawing, "do you ever think about how everything would be different if we hadn't gone to that auction? If we didn't see him?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Every day." She hadn't planned any of this, hadn't planned to spend her last $300 on a half-starved foal, hadn't planned to rebuild her life in the shadow of a barn, hadn't planned to rediscover parts of herself she thought were long gone. But Finch had a way of reshaping the world simply by being in it. He didn't just grow stronger. He pulled the people around him forward too, like a steady current tugging them toward a better shore. Lydia approached, brushing dust from her gloves. "Big news," she said, a hint of excitement beneath her calm tone. "They're hosting an amateur endurance showcase next month. Nothing competitive, just a chance for young horses to get used to a crowd and terrain. I want Finch there." Rachel blinked. "Already? Is he ready?" "He's more than ready," Lydia replied. "He needs exposure, and you two need to see what he can do in a real environment. It's not about winning, it's about stepping into the world." Mason jumped to his feet. "Mom, Finch is going to be in an event." Rachel laughed softly, her heart fluttering with nerves and pride. "Looks like it." The weeks that followed brimmed with preparation. Lydia guided Finch through gentle trail simulations while Hank strengthened his footing on various terrain types. Mason spent afternoons brushing Finch's coat until it gleamed, whispering encouragement like secret messages keyed only to the foal's ears. And Rachel. She found herself learning, too, how to believe in something uncertain, how to trust her own instincts again, how to stand tall even when the ground under her felt unpredictable. The morning of the showcase arrived with a pale sunrise stretching across the horizon. Finch loaded into the trailer calmly, his ears forward, as if he understood the significance of the day. Mason rode in the passenger seat, bouncing with excitement, while Rachel drove with a mixture of anticipation and quiet awe. The event grounds buzzed with chatter. Riders warming up their horses, spectators carrying steaming cups of coffee, the air filled with hay dust and the promise of possibility. Finch stepped out of the trailer with an alert but steady posture, taking in the new environment without fear. Even among dozens of horses, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had become his signature. As they guided him to the starting area, a small crowd began to form. People murmured, pointing subtly. "That's the foal from the Thompson place. He was rescued, right? Look how balanced he is." Rachel felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Lydia appeared at her side. "He's drawing attention," she murmured. "Good attention." Finch stood patiently between Mason and Rachel, his ears flicking toward their voices. When the announcer called for the first group, Rachel held her breath as Finch began his route with Lydia leading him. The trail wound along rolling hills, dipping into the edges of the forest and rising again toward the ridgeline. The spectators watched with curiosity, but Rachel watched with her whole heart. Finch didn't falter. He didn't rush. He didn't fear. He moved with intuition, exact, aware, unshakably present. Every shift of his weight aligned with the terrain, every stretch of his stride measured against the land beneath him. When a loose patch of gravel appeared near a turn, he adjusted instinctively. When a sudden bird burst from the brush, he flicked an ear without breaking focus. Halfway through the course, Lydia glanced back at Rachel, her smile bright and certain. Rachel felt tears press behind her eyes. By the end of the showcase, Finch wasn't just admired, he was unforgettable. Trainers stopped to ask questions. Riders complimented his gait. A handful of spectators even asked whether Rachel planned to compete professionally someday. She laughed shyly, overwhelmed, but Lydia answered with confidence. "She will," Lydia said, "and Finch will lead the way." On the ride home, Mason leaned against the window, watching the scenery blur past. "Mom," he said softly, "do you think Finch knows he saved us, too?" Rachel glanced at Finch through the trailer window, his silhouette steady and peaceful. "I think," she whispered, "he knew long before we did." When they arrived at Hank's, the late afternoon sun bathed the barn in warm orange light. Finch stepped into his stall as if returning to a temple built just for him. Mason hugged Rachel tightly. She held him just as tightly, overwhelmed by gratitude, for the journey they never expected, for the hope they'd rediscovered, for the life that had taken root in the most unlikely way. Finch nudged Rachel's shoulder gently, the same gentle gesture he'd offered on the cold night she first whispered he would stay. "Thank you," she murmured, pressing her hand to his neck, "for showing us what second chances can become." Outside, the wind moved softly across the fields, carrying with it the quiet hum of a future unfolding. A future bright, grounded, and finally within reach. They had saved Finch, but in ways she hadn't understood until now. Finch had saved them first. If this story touched your heart, we would love to hear from you. Share a short comment below and let us know which moment stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy true stories of hope, courage, and the bonds between people and animals, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories waiting for you.